And live from Studio 14 here at Al Jazeera headquarters in Doha, I'm Fuli Batibo. Welcome to the News Grid. Back from the dead, a high-profile Russian journalist who was said to have been gunned down in Ukraine shows up at a news conference in Kiev. Arkady Babchenko, a vocal critic of the Kremlin, has thanked Ukraine's security services for saving his life. We'll have a live report from Moscow on this extraordinary story. Also on the grid, the highest-ranking North Korean official to visit the U.S. in 18 years. Kim Yong-chol is due in New York for talks with the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. It's all part of the flurry of diplomatic efforts before the on-again, off-again summit between the U.S. president and North Korea's leader. And it's been the subject of much controversy. How many people were killed in Puerto Rico's hurricane catastrophe? The official count is 64, but a new study contends that thousands more actually died. We'll investigate why there's such a large discrepancy.
Just days after a refugee from Mali was honoured for his bravery and given French citizenship, hundreds of others see their shelters bulldozed in Paris. I'm Sarah Khairat with that and other top online trends. To connect with us throughout the show with the hashtag AJNewsGrid.
You're with the News Grid, live on air and streaming online through YouTube, Facebook Live and at aljazeera.com. Thank you for joining us. We begin with a shocking turn of events in what was thought to be the murder of a journalist and Kremlin critic in Ukraine. Arkady Babchenko has turned up alive and well at a news conference in Kiev. He's apologized to those who worried about him after everyone thought he was gunned down in front of his apartment in the Ukrainian capital. Russia had been accused of organizing the hit. Well, let's try and get our heads around this with Rory Challens, our correspondent in Moscow. Rory, where do we even begin? What an incredible turn of events. First of all, what has he said? What has Babchenko said in this news conference in Kiev?
Well, I mean, what Babchenko has said is essentially that he sends out his apologies to those who are closest to him. His wife did not even know about this. We had heard reports since the shooting yesterday, or what seemed to have been a shooting, that it was his wife who found him bleeding on the floor of their apartment and called an ambulance, and that he died on his way to hospital in the ambulance. She, it seems, did not know that he was not dead. And so in this press conference earlier in Kiev, he sent his apologies to his wife, saying that I'm sorry about this, but this is the way that it had to be done. Babchenko said that he had been involved essentially in this scheme, this sting operation for the past month, but the actual operation had been going on for a month before that. And the head of the Ukrainian Secret Service was saying that essentially it had been done to snare the assassin and to try and work out who the masterminds behind it were. So what he said, the head of the SBU, the Ukrainian Secret Service, is that 3 hours ago the organizer of this crime was arrested in the city of Kiev. Investigative actions with this individual are underway. In order to organize this cynical plan, Russian security services recruited a Ukrainian national who was tasked with finding the perpetrators of this cynical murder, and that there was a $40,000 price that was paid for it. So It seems that this was all some elaborate sting operation, but it's an extraordinary turn of events, an extraordinary outcome for what was looking like a fairly depressingly regular and familiar pattern.
And of course, the Ukrainians had pointed the finger of blame at Russia, Rory. Now that he's turned up alive, what are the Russians saying?
Well, the Russian response that we've had so far has come from the Foreign Ministry, which is fairly terse and brief, saying that actually the important thing, the best news, is that Babchenko is alive. But let's look a little bit further forward than this. This is a story that's going to reverberate, I think, for quite some time to come. And you're going to have to look at the tactics used by the Ukrainians here. We talk about living in a post-truth age where lies get thrown around, frequently picked up, replicated, broadcast on the media and churned out on Twitter, etc. This is the kind of thing that is not going to help combat that. You know,
Right.
if at some point in the future another Kremlin critic turns up dead, you might well hear from the Russian side, well, how do we know he actually is dead? Remember Babchenko. So I think there are lots of people who are online at the moment who are uneasy about this. Yes, they're relieved that a journalist is alive when they thought he was dead, but this is, you know, the tactics of this are questionable, I think.
Thank you for that, Rory Challenge, live for us in Moscow. And a lot of you who are watching us on Facebook Live, shocked about this turn of events. Donna here on Facebook saying, oh my God, wow, it's amazing that he's alive. Keep your comments coming. Hashtag AJ Newsgrid. Let's speak some more about this now to Samuel Green, who's the director of King's College Russia Institute. He is via Skype from London. Thank you for being with us. Ukrainian and Russian officials immediately traded finger-pointing over Babchenko's death. Now we know he's alive. What do you make of all this, Samuel?
Well, I mean, look, I'm watching this develop at the same time that you are learning of these things as they happen. It is very difficult to know what is to be made of it. I think it'll be very interesting to see where this investigation goes. The sting seems to have been organized for the express purpose of trying to figure out who was actually behind it. And the argument that the Ukrainians have put forward was that unless the masterminds of this thought that it had been successful, there would have been no way of actually identifying them. And that does tend to be the case. In a lot of these sorts of politicized hits, we do tend to see them catch the gunman, but not the organizer. So it will be interesting to see whether we learn anything from that investigation, whether the investigation is in fact both successful and credible. You can count obviously on the propaganda machine coming out of Moscow doing a lot to make it look less credible.
Right.
But we have to be honest that Ukrainian law enforcement doesn't have the best track record on these things.
Right, exactly. And, you know, Babchenko may be alive, but a number of other Russian critics who ended up in Kiev have died in recent years. Kiev has become a refuge for a lot of these dissidents. If the Ukrainian police are so sure about Russian involvement, why is it that they haven't completed any investigations into these previous killings? How do they explain that these killings have remained unsolved for so many years?
Well, I mean, I think part of that explanation is probably that the trail of evidence, or at least as they would argue, leads over the border into Russia, where they're of course not going to get any cooperation, and they can point fingers equally across the border and say, look, the murder of Boris Nemtsov, of Anna Politkovskaya in Russia itself, remain unsolved, or at least unsolved to the satisfaction of certainly any independent observer. You know, it's a valid question to ask, but I think that these sorts of attacks tend to be genuinely very hard to investigate.
All right, Samuel, thank you so much for talking to us about this developing story out of Ukraine. Samuel Green from King's College London joining us there on the News Grid. Now, in a separate development, British businessman Bill Browder, another critic of Russian President Vladimir Putin, has spent an hour in custody in Spain after being detained on a Russian Interpol arrest warrant. He tweeted his arrest as it happened. Spanish police then released him, saying the warrant is no longer valid. Browder's fund used to be the largest foreign investor in Russia. Then his tax accountant, Sergei Magnitsky, was detained after accusing Russian officials of tax fraud. Magnitsky died in prison. Browder and rights groups say he was tortured. Browder later successfully pushed the U.S. Congress to pass the Magnitsky Act, sanctioning top Russian officials accused of corruption. On to other world news now, and what promises to be one of the most important developments in weeks of rapid-fire diplomacy ahead of the possible meeting between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. The North Korean leader's right-hand man, Kim Yong-chol, is due to arrive in New York in just a few hours on a plane he boarded in Beijing early on Wednesday, and is set to have talks with the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Now, Kim Yong-chol is a skillful politician who's thrived through 3 generations of North Korea's ruling family, having worked his way up from border guard at the demilitarized zone to 4-star general. A former spy chief, he's now vice chairman of North Korea's ruling party and runs the department that manages relations with South Korea. He's played a big role in the talks process that started earlier this year, meeting the U.S. Secretary of State in Pyongyang. Live to our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett. Kimberly, Kim Yong-chol, no doubt a diplomatic heavyweight for the North Koreans, but this is also a man that was blacklisted by the U.S., and yet here he is coming to America, but not to Washington.
Right, not coming to Washington, and even just getting him to the United States. It's involved a little bit of behind-the-scenes maneuvering, given the fact that he is subject to U.S. sanctions. We are told by the spokesperson for the Secretary of State, Heather Nauert, that in fact steps had to be taken as a result of this. This will be the third meeting between the U.S. Secretary of State and the Vice Chair, as you point out, the right-hand man of North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un. But this certainly is on the radar of many Americans who are familiar with him. The United States, of course, accusing him of being behind the cyber hacking that happened many years ago with regard to Sony Pictures when it was set to release a film satirizing the North Korean leader. So there's a lot of work to be done, a lot to be worked out, particularly when it comes to some of the issues. And that's what we are told will happen when he arrives to meet with the U.S. Secretary of State in New York. Some of the issues that will be worked out is the gap that seems to be between both sides when it comes to the definition of denuclearization. And also, there are going to be some details that will be worked out when the Secretary of State meets with the president in advance of that very important New York meeting.
Kimberly, some U.S. intelligence reports have suggested that North Korea has no intention of dismantling its nuclear arsenal in the near future. Could this affect the upcoming summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un?
That's one of the big concerns. And so that's why there is this advance meeting taking place, because there's a need to settle the agenda, to work on what the shared understanding is of what can be achieved. There's a lot of trust that is lacking on both sides. There's the concern by the North Koreans that the U.S. is not going to keep its word. There's also that concern on the other side. And then there's another factor in all of this, Folly, and that is that you have to remember that the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe will be here at the White House June 7th to make sure that South Korea and Japan's interests are reflected in all of this, too. There's a lot at stake for them. They're worried that if a deal is struck, that it may not include the concerns about short-range missiles that threaten that region, and also the issue of the Japanese abductees that the Japanese say were abducted were taken by North Korea in the 70s and 80s and have not yet been returned. So there are a lot of regional interests at play. There are a lot of interests between the United States and North Korea, some of that going to be worked out in the very early preliminary stages in New York.
Thank you for that, Kimberly Halkett, our White House correspondent, live there in Washington. And don't forget, you can stay on top of North Korea's biggest stories by Al Jazeera on our website, aljazeera.com. More on there about Kim Yong-sol, Kim Jong-un's right-hand man. Also, find out about what Koreans think of the recent rapprochement between North and South in this piece by Woo Young Lee, who spoke to a number of people, students, barbers, and North Korean activists, to hear their views on the improving relations. Now, we're getting a lot of comments on our top story on the news grid today, and that is, of course, the Russian dissident, Kremlin critic, who was reported killed in Ukraine, but now turns out he's alive and well. A comment here from Jen, who says that is impressive and terrifying. Hopefully he can get the protection he needs. Arkady Babchenko, again, reported alive and well after earlier been described as dead, killed in Ukraine. Don't forget to tweet us your comments and questions on this and other stories that we're covering on the News Grid today. The hashtag on social media, AJ Newsgrid. Moving on now, and there's a new twist in the wrangling following Iraq's elections. Results from more than 1,000 polling stations, about 2% of the total, are being declared null and void. The Electoral Commission says it has evidence of fraud at voting locations, both inside Iraq and abroad, where expats cast their ballots. It was the first election using an electronic voting system. An alliance led by Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr won the most parliamentary seats in a blow to a bloc led by the incumbent Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi. Charles Stratford is in Baghdad for us to explain this all to us. Charlie, are these irregularities big enough to alter the overall results of the elections?
I think one has to be cautious here in making those kind of predictions. I think what it really highlights, though, is just how difficult it is in this country to come together, for parliamentarians, for politicians to come together and break what can only be described as decades of sectarian tension and partisanship. What's interesting is that these areas that the Independent Election Commission has described now as the voting in those areas as being null and void are predominantly Sunni areas like Nineveh and Diyala and Anbar province. And there's this push from today, the second session of an open session that was called by parliamentarians, pushed by 28 members of parliament, predominantly Sunni, who say that they want a complete recount of all votes across the country, which, as I say, highlights, certainly according to analysts here, the kind of tension between a Shia-led government and these three main blocs, the three Shia blocs that are in first, second and third place in those election results. Interestingly, Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, trying to diffuse tensions, has said yesterday in his press conference, his weekly press conference, called for these election results to be honoured, said that he wanted an investigation into these allegations of fraud, but he was concerned about what he described as a political vacuum that this kind of crisis could potentially cause, because, of course, on the 30th of June, the current parliamentary session, as according to the Constitution, ends. So it's difficult to say what kind of impact this is going to have with respect to the election results itself, but what it does highlight, as I say, is these kind of sectarian tensions that we have seen in Iraq for decades now.
Thank you for that, Charles Stratford, live for us in Baghdad. All you need to know about Iraq's elections on AlJazeera.com, why they're important, what's expected now after these results, and who's likely to become Prime Minister. All the important questions answered there on AlJazeera.com. Now, in the last 24 hours, Gaza has seen the worst fighting in years, but relative calm appears to have returned for now. On Tuesday, Israel carried out several airstrikes targeting what it called military sites across the besieged enclave. It was retaliation for a barrage of rockets and mortar shells fired by the armed Palestinian group Islamic Jihad and Hamas, which rules the Gaza Strip. They now say Egyptian mediators intervened to secure a ceasefire agreement with Israel. Live to Harry Fawcett, our correspondent who joins us from Gaza. Harry, so we're hearing about a meeting of the Israeli cabinet soon. What are we expecting to hear on Gaza?
Well, yes, the Israeli Security Cabinet is meeting at military headquarters in Tel Aviv. And just ahead of that meeting, we heard from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in a statement saying that Israel had beaten factions in Gaza like they hadn't for several years, and that should there be any more coming out of Gaza, they would pay twice the price. So more extremely aggressive language coming from the Israeli Prime Minister in response to what was the biggest such exchange since the 2014 war. The Israeli military says that 100 rockets and mortars were fired out from inside Gazan territory during the course of that exchange, and that 65 targets inside Gaza were struck in return from the air by the Israeli Air Force. And so all of it coming to an end, for now at least, at 4 o'clock this morning local time, some 14 hours ago. As you say, there are extensive reports that Egypt had a great deal to do with it. We're hearing from the Egyptian side sources saying that the Egyptians were clear that if Hamas did not put a lid on this for now, there would be further action escalation from the Israeli side, in which there could be serious casualties among the people within the armed factions here inside Gaza. The Israelis are saying that there's been no official ceasefire to which they have signed up, but as long as there is calm coming from Gaza, it will be met with calm from the other side. The Israeli army has told Israeli people living on the other side of the fence separating Gaza from Israel that the emergency situation is now over. That jibes with what we saw coming into Gaza earlier on, when we saw tanks and other military equipment being taken away northwards from the Gaza border. We have in the last few minutes as well heard from 13 Palestinian factions. They say that they have changed the rules of engagement with Israel. They've shown Israel that for every rocket that comes their way, the Israelis will get another one in return. It does show a difference from at least how Islamic Jihad was responding for many months now to the loss of its fighters with relative silence. Now they have carried out this attack. It's also been a reminder to both sides, should it be needed, of just how quickly these sorts of things can escalate. For now, it seems neither side wants to go any further.
Thank you, Harry. Harry Fawcett, live for us in Gaza. Meanwhile, 2 Palestinians are still in Israeli detention after taking part in an attempt to break Israel's naval blockade from inside Gaza. The Israeli military arrested a total of 17 people after boarding the vessel without incident just off Gaza's coast on Tuesday. It was carrying mostly students and people in need of medical care. They wanted to sail to Cyprus. Now, the most contentious issue between Israelis and Palestinians remains, of course, the disputed holy city of Jerusalem. And our online teams put together this great interactive, taking you through a brief tour of East Jerusalem with a mostly Palestinian population and West Jerusalem, which is entirely Jewish, to highlight the disparity in infrastructure and quality of life for Israelis and Palestinians. Check it out on our website, aljazeera.com. Time now for a look at the other international headlines. Here's Mariam Namaze in our London News Centre.
Well, we begin with developments in Italy, where the Prime Minister-designate says new possibilities have emerged to form a government. Carlo Cottarelli made the comments while visiting the presidential palace for informal talks about forming a new technocratic government. President Sergio Mattarella appointed Cottarelli, a former IMF official, in a bid to calm the market turmoil. It comes after he blocked the appointment of a Eurosceptic economy minister chosen by the Five Star Movement and League Party last week over fears it would hurt Italy's economy. So let's get more now from Nadeem Barber, who joins us in Rome. What are the chances of the Prime Minister-designate being able to present a cabinet anytime soon?
Well, Mariam, it's a very fluid situation, but I think you can say that the chances of Mr. Cottarelli himself being in charge for any length of time are diminishing, because on Sunday, after President Mattarella said that he just couldn't accept Paolo Savona, the choice of economy minister of that coalition, it became clear that the parties involved, Five Star and the League, were going to vote against him in Parliament, that he would lose a vote of confidence in Parliament. And so now he has been talking again on Wednesday with President Mattarella, as he did on Tuesday, without presenting a cabinet. But his entourage have been saying that they are also aware of the possibility of a political government still being formed. In other words, perhaps they're hearing through different channels that those parties are willing to compromise on the choice of economy minister so that they can go ahead and try to take power. Because if they don't, then at least one of the partners, the League, the far-right party under Matteo Salvini, are still pushing for elections as soon as possible. The belief here is that the Five Star Movement, perhaps a bit more conciliatory, willing to back an interim administration through the summer to get through a budget before fresh elections expected in the autumn. Very fluid, as I say, right now. No official statements on the record so far, and so people have it in mind that they very well might be called to elections in the next few months. But if it does happen in the summer, if that's triggered, it won't be a popular move because many people will be away on holiday.
We know that the president has taken steps to try and calm the turmoil in global markets. Nadeem, how much instability has this caused?
That's right. I mean, his whole point from Sunday evening was, I had to do this to avoid instability, to avoid Italian savings being hit. Now, of course, there was an impact. On Tuesday, we saw stock exchanges around the world down. For example, the Dow Jones in New York down around 1.5%, London down over 1%, and Italian bank shares taking a hit as well. But just in the last couple of hours, the European Central Bank, informally via sources, quote, close to the matter, have been speaking to Reuters press agency, saying that the ECB sees no sign, no reason that it should intervene in Italy at all at the moment, because there's no sign of stress amongst the bank. Interbank lending is healthy, deposits are stable, and they see the crisis right now as purely political. So far, that is, because it's only lasted a few days. So there was an impact on Tuesday, and let's not forget that in Brussels, the Budget Commissioner Günther Oettinger said that he thought that the negative impact of what's happened might actually teach voters here a lesson. He said that it might show them that they should not vote for populist parties. He was slapped down by several figures in Brussels, but it may turn out that if there is some kind of compromise quickly here, that his dire warnings, in fact, will just be theoretical anyway.
Thank you very much. Nadeem Baba with all the latest from Rome. Well, now to Afghanistan, where ISIL gunmen have launched a brazen attack on the Interior Ministry headquarters in the capital, Kabul. A car bomb was detonated at the first checkpoint leading to the ministry before fighters armed with assault rifles and grenade launchers tried to storm their way inside. One policeman was killed in the attack and 5 others injured.
A suicide attacker detonated his explosive at the entrance of the Interior Ministry and wounded 2 people. Right after the blast, I saw other attackers who had military uniforms getting out from an armed vehicle.
Jennifer Glass has more from Kabul.
The explosions and gunfire went on for about 2 hours. The Interior Ministry says there were 8 assailants in all. First attacker blowing himself up in a car at the main gate of the Interior Ministry and 7 other attackers moving in. They were eventually killed by Afghan security forces. The Interior Ministry is a highly fortified building. It had just recently been moved to the outskirts of town to allow for more room and to make sure that it could be better protected. So very, very clearly an audacious attack on a major target here. Now, the Taliban launched its spring offensive last month, and in recent days it issued a warning to Afghans to stay away from ministries, from police stations, from anything associated with the military or the government. Both the Taliban and ISIL have launched a number of attacks here in Kabul, and the Taliban is on the offensive around the country as well, taking over a district in the northeast of the country in Takhar province today, as well as launching attacks on police stations around the country as well. So it's been a very, very difficult fighting season so far for the Afghan military. And as we get closer to elections coming up in October, it's really believed that the violence will continue and possibly escalate.
Thousands of workers in Greece have walked off the job in protest at a new wave of austerity measures. Labour unions have called for a 24-hour general strike against the reforms, which are part of Greece's bailout agreement with foreign lenders. Schools have been closed and flights have been disrupted, along with public transport. Hospitals only have emergency staff on hand. Greece's latest bailout ends in August, but the austerity measures will continue for at least 2 more years. Belgian police have honoured 2 officers who were killed in a stabbing and shooting rampage on Tuesday. Colleagues of the 2 female victims observed a minute of silence in the city of Liège, where the attack took place. They were killed by an inmate on a 2-day release in what prosecutors are calling a terrorist murder. The gunman was killed on the scene.
He had left the prison of Marjan-Famenne on Monday, the 28th of 2018 at 7:30 a.m., granted a temporary exit permit. Normally, he should have returned to the prison on Tuesday, the 29th of May at 7:30 p.m. The man is also suspected of a manslaughter in the small village of On in Marjan-Famenne. The exact circumstances of this offence are the subject of a separate investigation by the Marjan-Famenne section of the Luxembourg Public Prosecutor's Office.
I'll have more from London in about 30 minutes' time. Now back to Folly in Doha.
Mariam, thank you very much for that. If you're watching us on Facebook Live, coming up, we'll reveal what happened when a bunch of far-right German nationalists tried to march in Berlin. And still ahead on the news grid, Brazil's strike troubles get even worse. First it was truckers, now oil workers are walking off the job.
Alle Menschen und die AfD versucht, diese Gesellschaft zu spalten, hat noch nie Probleme gelöst und ist absolut destruktiv und dem Hass.
Es ist das Land unserer Väter und unserer Mütter und wir wollen es behalten, wie wir es übernommen haben.
Our top stories on the news grid and the top trending stories on AlJazeera.com. The stories you're looking at in Italy's political crisis about to get much worse as there's still no government there after the elections. At number 2, Hamas and Israel, the ceasefire holding in Gaza after a night of violence, and the latest attack in Kabul, Afghanistan, where the ministry was the target of bombs and gunfire. Much more on all those stories on our website at AlJazeera.com. Here with the news grid on Al Jazeera. We've got people watching today from Canada, Liberia and Guam. Thank you for your company. We'd love to hear from you on all the stories we're covering. You can send in your comments and questions to any of our online platforms. Tweet us at AJ English or on Facebook at facebook.com/AJ Newsgrid. You can also WhatsApp us at +974 501 111 49. The number is about to show up on your screen very shortly. Don't forget also the hashtag AJ Newsgrid. Moving on, and French police have moved in on Paris's biggest refugee and migrant camp, where 1,700 people were living in tents alongside a canal. Officers arrived at dawn along with bulldozers as people emerged from their tents to be bussed away to gymnasiums. A new immigration law being pushed by President Emmanuel Macron will increase deportations for economic migrants who've come to France looking for a better life rather than fleeing war or persecution. Sarah, our social media producer, is back. And Sarah, people are talking online about how different this is from the other migrant story that we heard earlier this week out of France.
Yeah, I'll explain a little bit more because he was quickly called a real-life Spider-Man. Mamadou Gassama scaled a building in Paris to rescue a 4-year-old boy who was clinging on for dear life from a balcony you can just see there. And Gassama arrived in France in September, having risked a dangerous journey from Mali all the way to Europe years earlier. But after his heroic act this week, French President Emmanuel Macron met him and gave him French citizenship and a job at the Paris Fire Brigade. Now, the rescue video went viral, prompting thousands of people all around the world to praise Mamadou on social media for his bravery and quick action. But some, like British politician David Lammy, say migrants shouldn't have to behave like superheroes before being treated like human beings. And that's been much of the narrative in the wake of the camp closure in Paris as well. French Interior Minister says migrants and refugees will be housed temporarily across Paris while their identities are cross-checked. But Gerald Colomb says it's inevitable that some of them will be deported. Now, cartoons like these are also being shared on social media, drawing comparisons between how differently people view Mamadou Gassama compared to the hundreds of thousands of other refugees and migrants that are trying to reach Europe. Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo believes the government has mishandled the camp evacuations. She wants to build a more permanent housing instead.
We shouldn't have waited 4 months to put these people in a safe place. This should have happened sooner. I've made a proposal to the government for the construction of a proper welcome center like the one at Porte de Chapelle, which is the only solution to prevent these makeshift camps on the streets. So I'm waiting to hear the government's response.
Now, the refugees and migrants at the camp have been speaking out, not knowing where they're going to be ending up after being cleared out earlier on Tuesday.
Stay 1 month here is very, very, very bad for me. All the people have a sickness like this, sickness and like this, and not have food, not have everything.
It has been hard here. It's dirty. There's no toilet, no shower to wash in. It's too hard. For more than 3 days, I haven't had a shower. You don't eat well here. Sometimes I eat, sometimes I don't. It's like that.
This is a never-ending situation. Why? Because of the Dublin Convention. The Italians have the migrants' fingerprints, but they don't hand out any papers, so the migrants end up in the street. They come to France where they apply for asylum, but then they are sent back to Italy, and they come back here again, ending up on the street. This situation is very complicated. If they don't give us any papers, we'll forever stay on the streets. That's what I believe. Nothing will change.
Well, we're going to have to see what will happen with that. But in the wake of all of this, people like Shankar are encouraging others to recognise the good deeds that refugees do on a daily basis. And you can do just that with the hashtag that's being used. It's MyNewNeighbour. But also, why don't you loop me in on that as well? My Twitter handle is Sarah Khairat. We've got more to come, so leave your live comments with our hashtag as well, AJ Newsgrid.
Another story of human suffering, Sarah, and thousands of Rohingya women who say they were raped by soldiers in Myanmar are due to give birth in overcrowded Bangladeshi camps where they fled for safety. More than 700,000 Rohingya Muslims have sought refuge there. Mariana Hunt has this story.
Fatima was just 16 and newly married when she says Myanmar army soldiers killed her husband. As they burned her village, she fled into the forest, but soldiers caught her there and she says one of them raped her. After the trauma of trying to make it to Bangladesh, she discovered she was pregnant, but she doesn't know who the father is, her late husband or the soldier who raped her.
He's my baby. How can I throw him away? I have to love him.
More than 700,000 Muslim Rohingya fled a military crackdown in Myanmar's Rakhine state late last year. 9 months on, births at Rohingya camps in Bangladesh are expected to rise dramatically. The UN expects 25,000 babies will be born in May and June. That's 9,000 more than the first 4 months of the year. Overwhelmed by shame, the UN says many rape victims have sought to hide their pregnancies, while others have tried to terminate them in dangerous home abortions. Fatima says she made an early decision to keep her baby, no matter the shame.
Allah gave me this baby, so I shouldn't be afraid. I will raise this baby properly.
UN agencies are working to provide healthcare for refugees and to work with communities to ensure rape victims and their children don't face discrimination. But they admit they're already struggling to get funding for the basics, like food and shelter.
Right now, we're only a fifth of the way there. The United Nations Joint Response estimates that we will need $950 million US. That's a lot of money, but not when you consider that it's 1 million people.
The United Nations describes what happened to the Rohingya as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. But the government of Aung San Suu Kyi insists no atrocities occurred and that it was simply defending itself after attacks from armed Rohingya. Fatima's baby, like tens of thousands of others, will now be born into an overcrowded and unsanitary camp. Mariana Hunt, Al Jazeera.
And if you get a chance, watch this excellent documentary on the plight of Rohingya women by our team at 101 East. Brides and Brothels, the Rohingya trade explores how thousands of Rohingya girls who have survived rape and the slaughter of their families continue to face sexual exploitation, forced marriage and trafficking in refugee camps. It's an excellent documentary. You can find it on aljazeera.com. Just click under documentaries and then 101 East. Now, Brazilian oil workers now are walking off the job as the country struggles after a debilitating truckers' strike. That strike is now easing, and the military is being deployed to protect truckers who want to go back to work. Now, oil sector workers say they'll strike for 72 hours, even though the action has been declared illegal. Live to Daniel Schramner, who's in Paulínia near Sao Paulo. So the oil workers, Daniel, joining the truckers in striking. Tell us about where you are first and what's happening around you.
Yes, hi, I'm outside the main oil refinery in Paulínia, which is about 2 hours from the city of Sao Paulo. There are workers behind me. They are on a 72-hour stoppage, as you say, but since this strike has been declared illegal by the government, it's very much a symbolic gesture for now. They too are asking for a reduction in fuel prices, which they, along with much of the population of Brazil, say are much too high. They would also like to see the departure of the CEO of Petrobras, Brazil's main oil company, Pedro Parente. They want him to go. They want to see a wholesale reorganization of the company and the way the company is run. It has to be said that many Brazilians, despite the truck drivers going back to work, some of them very reluctantly, a poll came out today saying that more than 80% of Brazilians support the strike, the truck drivers' action. As I say, they too very angry about the oil prices and the way the government is handling this crisis.
So there is support for the strikes, but what about the current political and economic climate in Brazil? How do people feel about that?
Well, a very difficult situation. We've got elections, presidential elections coming up in October. The current president, Michel Temer, enjoys is the wrong word, has some of the worst approval ratings in Brazilian history. And I think it's fair to say that in general, the Brazilian population is disillusioned, disenchanted with many of their politicians. The previous president, Dilma Rousseff, was impeached. The president before that, President Lula, is now serving a 12-year prison term for corruption. It's very difficult to see which way Brazilian politics is going. So President Temer has a very difficult situation in trying to control this, enjoys very little support among the Brazilian population, which continues to see those prices rise. And normally in these kind of situations, people would have been angry with the truckers for stopping the foodstuffs reaching market, for the shortage of fuel. People were queuing up for many hours outside the filling stations. Schools were closed, some domestic flights were cancelled. But in general, with a few exceptions, people were supporting them because they generally agree with the demands of the truckers. And it seems unlikely that the accord they've reached with the government will hold for very long. They've lowered the prices for up to 60 days, but it's a very fragile truce, a temporary truce, and it does seem as though there will be further protests in the weeks and months to come.
Thank you for that, Daniel. Daniel Schreimler, live for us in Paulínia, near Sao Paulo, Brazil. Thank you. Now, the U.S. says it will impose a 25% tariff on $50 billion worth of imports from China. It will also restrict investment by Chinese companies in the U.S. and limit exports of high-tech goods to China. Earlier this month, the two countries agreed to look at measures to cut China's trade surplus in a move that appeared to reduce the risk of a trade war. Florence Rui has more from Zhejiang in eastern Jiangsu province.
China says it's surprised at the latest announcement coming out from the Trump administration and called on the U.S. to implement the spirit of their most recent joint statement. Now, China's Commerce Ministry is, of course, referring to a preliminary deal reached between the two sides not too long ago, in which the U.S. had agreed to delay imposition of tariffs on Chinese goods in exchange for China agreeing to significantly increase purchases of U.S. farm goods and energy products. But this latest announcement from the U.S. government is, of course, a reversal of that deal, and it comes just days before U.S. representatives are due to arrive in Beijing to continue trade talks. Now, some analysts have said that this latest announcement by the U.S. government is intended perhaps to strengthen U.S. hand in those negotiations and to signal that gloves are coming off in those trade talks. And other analysts have said that this perhaps is a move to appease U.S. politicians. You see, just last week, the Trump administration had made another reversal. It lifted a 7-year ban that it had imposed just earlier in May on Chinese telecoms giant ZTE Corp from buying U.S. components. Now, it lifted the ban after China complained that the ban would put the company out of business. This is a company that has already been fined by the U.S. for selling high-tech components to North Korea and Iran in violation of U.S. sanctions. China's reaction, you can say, has been quite mild. They've not reiterated threats to impose retaliatory tariffs, but they seem to have taken a sly dig at Trump administration and its propensity to flip-flop on decisions, saying they're surprised, but at the same time, the decision is somewhat expected.
Now, when Hurricane Maria hit the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico last September, the local governor described it as the biggest catastrophe in the island's modern history. And now a study contends that thousands more people died than the official government death toll of 64. The researchers believe that at least 4,600 people were killed. And when you take into account those who lost their lives due to failures of medical and other infrastructure in the storm's aftermath. In the days, weeks and months that followed, roads and power lines were slow to be restored. Millions suffered through a long blackout, including patients in hospitals relying on respirators. It's estimated that Maria caused at least $100 billion in damages. Well, let's speak some more about this now to Alexis Raul Santos, who's the director of the graduate program in applied demography at Pennsylvania State University. He's via Skype from the City of State College. Thank you very much for being with us, Alexis. This is the biggest number as far as deaths in Puerto Rico, but certainly not the first study to estimate a much higher death toll than the government's death toll, which stands at 64. Why is there such a huge discrepancy in these figures?
Yes, all the studies that have been conducted since November onward point towards an excess deaths of approximately 1,000 or more. And I think the death toll, the official death toll, has stayed low because the government is using a very narrow definition of deaths associated with Hurricane Maria. They're only counting deaths that are associated directly with the hurricane, say somebody fell from the roof or somebody was killed by flying debris. Those were the persons they are counted. If somebody wanted their family member to be added to the official count, they needed to do it through a long bureaucratic process, which was not possible, say, for example, for somebody who was still recovering from the damages they suffered due to Hurricane Maria.
And the Puerto Rican government, Alexis, stopped issuing numbers in December of 2017. How much of an impact would that have had on the study?
Because of the policy or the action they took to stop sharing data, all we can do is approximate the number of deaths using estimation techniques. The researchers of the study that was published yesterday used a validated method of sampling households across a population and applying statistical techniques so that they can make inferences about a population from a small sample. Right. So as long as data is not shared, we're going to be relying on estimation techniques to approximate a number of deaths associated with a hurricane.
Yeah, and we're just days away now from the next hurricane season, Alexis. How better prepared are they this time around?
It is difficult for me to say that they're ready for a next hurricane, although that has been the official narrative that the government has been saying for the last month. I went to the island 2 weeks ago, and a lot of things that I saw would not have been there under normal conditions. There's still areas that haven't gotten any energy since September last year, and certainly those areas are not ready for another hurricane season. And nonetheless, they haven't recovered from the previous hurricane that struck the island back in September.
Alexis Raul Santos, thank you so very much for talking to us here on the News Grid. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Now, earlier we brought you the story about electoral fraud in Iraq. Well, similar allegations are flooding social media in other parts of the world. Sarah's back to explain. Sarah.
That's right, in Colombia. In fact, Colombians are heading back to the polls in just 3 weeks for a presidential runoff. It's between Gustavo Petro, you see him there on the left, and Ivan Duque. Petro is a left-wing candidate seen as a champion of the poor and a formula guerrilla who supports the Colombian government. On the other side is conservative Ivan Duque. He represents the status quo and those opposed to the 2016 peace deal that ended decades of war with FARC rebels. But accusations of electoral corruption looms over the nation's vote because in the last 24 hours, the hashtag electoral fraud, which is in Spanish, has been trending worldwide. And in fact, Colombians have been posting their Sunday ballot papers they found, allegedly showing results being tampered with. If you have a look at this one, for example, it shows that Duque has got 730 votes. I'll just scroll up there, just on the right side there. But if you actually look at the total count of all of those in that municipality, is 229, which doesn't quite add up. But it's hard for us, of course, to verify the authenticity of this alleged ballot paper. But what people online are highlighting are numbers that actually don't quite look like they've matching up with the rest, and they look like they've been altered. So this is an example of what people are finding on those ballot papers. Now, there have been calls for international media outlets to look into the E14 form, which we've just seen, and allegations it's been modified in favour of the winning candidate, and that's Ivan Duque. Now, he won Sunday's first round and is favourite to win the runoff in June. People have been commenting, like Maiden Monroe says, Colombia has suffered with fraud and corruption for 16 years and needs a change. And she says she's going to be voting for Petro Gustavo, who has highlighted the problem of voter fraud during his campaign already. But not everyone agrees. There are people like Diego who says the fraud accusations are actually lacking credibility and is a desperate attempt by the opposition to take down Duque. But hundreds of people have actually been bombarding the Twitter account of the government body overseeing the election. And if you have a look just through here as I scroll, you can see there are plenty of messages with people also posting that E14 form. Now, others are also asking to have explanations of why those discrepancies are taking place. But it has denied that the fraud has taken place in the first place. Now, adding to that, it's said that electoral observers would have demanded a recount had there been any suspicion of ballot fraud. But this isn't the first time accusations like this have surfaced, because independent investigations have showed results in legislative elections held in March, which is what you can see in that video there, were tampered with, and the same has happened during the 2014 election. Now, if you're in Colombia, then we want to hear from you. That's ahead of the June 17 presidential runoff. I'm on Twitter. You can tweet me or even direct message me as well. And if there are any stories that you think we should be covering, the hashtag is NewsGrid, so do get in touch.
Sarah, thank you very much. Returning now to our top story and an update on it. The Russian dissident journalist that turned up at a news conference in Kiev after being reported murdered has given some details about what happened. Here's some of what he had to say.
As far as I know, this operation was prepared over 2 months. I was made aware 1 month ago. Over this month, I saw how the guys worked, how they dug things up like buffaloes. Over this month, we were in constant contact. We thought things through and worked out the details. The result of that became this special operation, as a result of which one person has been detained.
All right, still ahead on the News Grid, we'll take you to a neighborhood in the U.S. which is thriving in a sustainable and greener life, relying on solar power and electric cars. Can it work everywhere? Welcome back. Now, sustainable living is a phrase you hear a lot these days, and in one part of the U.S., it's becoming a reality. An entirely solar-powered city is taking shape in Florida, and people are already living a greener life. Andy Gallagher went and had a look.
In a state peppered with retirement villages and golf courses, Babcock Ranch looks like just another new development. However, few communities have driverless buses or are powered entirely by the sun like this one. This solar array is the largest of its kind in the world and will provide clean, renewable energy for years to come.
Well, this is the birth of a new town. This is Founder Square. And
developer Sid Kitson says the project sets new standards and possibilities for how we live.
We are trying to create the most sustainable, environmentally responsible new city that's ever been developed in the world. And we're doing it. We're not just not talking about it, we're doing it. And our goal is that people will come here and see it and copy it.
From renderings to reality, families began buying homes and moving in at the beginning of the year. Jim and Donna Avek found out about the project years ago and are among the first residents.
I don't know if we're setting an example because we're doing this for us. We love this lifestyle. If they look at it and say, wow, they are really doing something great and they follow us, that would be an added benefit.
Enrollment at the community's school is already underway as more families move in, but Babcock Ranch is still growing.
Developers say that more than 50,000 people will live here by the time the final phase is complete, making this one of the biggest self-sustained communities in the country. Homes here are relatively affordable, but the land is also key. 90% of it is now a preserve and will be cherished for generations to come.
Local ranchers say working with developers and helping preserve the land is a natural partnership.
Farmers and ranchers has always been stewards of the land even before anybody thought up of any of this stuff. Whatever this land gives you is what you make that year. We have to take care of it.
From conception to breaking ground, it took more than a decade to get this project underway. But Babcock Ranch is now a real-world example of how cities of the future might look. Andy Gallagher, Al Jazeera, Babcock Ranch, Florida.
Well, that's it for today's show. Don't forget, we're on social media at all times. Hashtag AJ Newsgreat. From me, Fuli Batibo, and the whole team, thank you for watching. We'll see you back here at Studio 14 at 1500 GMT on Thursday.